about that, folks. That's the danger of going live. I am the groundwater guy, and welcome to Groundwater Talk Live. Today we have groundwater news, PFAS, and drought and bacteria. Oh my! So that's what we're going to talk about today. We got a bunch of different news stories out there that I think you may find interesting. I comb the water news every day to bring you some of this information. We usually talk about groundwater news about once a month or so. Just kind of cover these stories that may be useful and relevant to water system operators and other people that are interested in water. So before we get going, I just ask everybody if they can like, comment, share. It really helps us break through the clutter. I answer all the comments, on LinkedIn and wherever, and the YouTube channel. So wherever, if you have a comment, please feel free to share, and I answer all those. And if nothing else, like, and if you like what you got, share it with other folks so we can break through the clutter. Thank you. All right, so today we're going to cover, here on Groundwater Talk Live, we're going to cover the news. And so we got some interesting stories about PFAS. That is the hot topic out there. And that is also known as the forever chemical because it is hard to remediate and it is hard it is very persistent in the environment. It doesn't break down real well. So really, it's quite a challenge and quite expensive to clean up. So we got some news on that. We're going to talk a little bit about the drought in the West, and it's interesting how it's shaping up, and some of the weather patterns and what to expect, and then finally we got some bacteria news, and a lot of people don't appreciate the fact that bacteria are really an important part of groundwater. There's bacteria. We look at testing for coliform and E. coli, and it's really something that's what people focus on as far as bacteria. But there's a lot of bacteria in water doing different things. A lot of bacteria is involved in biofilms and slime formers and those types of things that can plug up our wells. But there's other stuff going on too. So there's always bacteria there. You can never get rid of all the bacteria. So it's something we just gotta kind of manage. But just some interesting news here today. I got a couple of stories on bacteria, and I do pay attention to that. It's one of the things we look at in the well diagnostic process. So I got a couple interesting stories here. So with that, let's dive in here. And first off, I'm going to talk about the PFAS situation. Let me just switch over here to my browser. I got some stories here. The first one is one of the first settlements out there for PFAS, and so this is 1.18 billion deal to resolve PFAS water contamination situation. And as we go down here, you can see that three chemical companies, all of which are related to DuPont, which is officially known as DuPont de Nemours, French company, the Chemours company, and Corteva Inc. Those are all spin-off of DuPont. They have said that they're going to establish a $1.18 billion fund to fund cleanup of PFAS. The PFAS is a whole series of chemicals. They're perfluorinated compounds, and they've been primarily used, they're used in a lot of different things, but one of the things that DuPont has used it in is firefighting chemicals. And so we find a lot of places where they do firefighting training, where they're using the foam that has the PFAS in it. We have these big PFAS plumes in the groundwater. So, and PFAS plumes can get pretty big actually, because they do not, there's not a lot of natural attenuation that goes on. They're not very sticky on clay grains like a lot of different contaminants are. So they don't attenuate really well. So they form really big plumes. They get in the groundwater. They get in drinking water, and so they're contaminating things. We're seeing the EPA is pushing to come out with some MCLs for PFAS that are going to be fairly low in the parts per trillion range. So there's going to be some cleanup ahead of us, And like I say, because they are fairly difficult to clean up, it's going to be expensive cleanup. So this is the first settlement. Obviously, um, it's let's just look here that this was going to go to trial in early June. The story is from June 3rd. And so they came up with a settlement right before trial. So it was probably in their best interest because they might have ended up spending a lot more than the 1.18 billion. So anyway, this happened in South Carolina. People were uh, well, that's where the trial was going to take place. So they pulled together a bunch of complaints. Now, this is not the only set of companies involved in PFAS, and some of the lawsuits are continuing on some of these other ones, but they're the first ones to settle. So it may actually kind of break the dam a little bit, and we may see more money coming available for PFAS. It is quite challenging. So what they said is the company said in a joint statement that the proposed settlement would comprehensively resolve all PFAS-related drinking water claims of a defined class of public water systems that serve the vast majority of the United States population. So that group could include thousands of public water systems, from large cities to small, for small utilities. And basically, to qualify for shares of the fund, they would have to test their waters and detect PFAS. And probably a lot of them already know that they have PFAS. I mean, some people have not tested, but I think a lot of these water systems that are at risk have certainly tested and know. So the judge still has to approve the deal. Like you said, the companies, water providers are free to opt out and pursue separate cases, but probably most people, it's probably not going to be worthwhile to do that. This type of litigation is pretty expensive. So there were 200 plaintiffs, they said, ranging from California to South Dakota to Massachusetts. So my goodness, my phone is ringing off the hook today. The agreement excludes systems owned by states or U.S. government and small systems that haven't detected PFAS and aren't legally required to monitor for it. So once the EPA sets the MCLs, then pretty much all systems are going to be required to monitor for it. So it's unclear to me how this actually affects those people that haven't detected PFAS yet because they're not required to test for it, but that they will in the future. Will they be able to tap into this? Because my feeling is $1.18 billion sounds like a lot of money, but when you spread that all over the country, it's not really that much. Now, there are other cases. There's thousands of cases against other PFAS manufacturers and dealers, among them 3M, which was the primary manufacturer of firefighting foam containing PFAS compounds, Tyco Fire Products, ChemGuard. And so actually in early June, I believe the trial started in Stuart, Florida's case against 3M. So it'll be interesting to see if they come up with any settlements there too, or if these companies are going to take their chances in trial. That's on the settlement. Now let's look at, and when I say that $1.1 billion is not going to go far when you spread it across the country, here's a study that was done in Minnesota. And granted, the caveat here is this done looking at wastewater, but what it illustrates is the fact that the costs of cleaning up PFAS are pretty expensive. That $1.18 billion seems like a lot, but it is a drop in the bucket. So in Minnesota, and the gist of this is that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency published this study, and they looked at PFAS in certain wastewater streams across Minnesota, and they determined that just in the wastewater streams, it would cost between 14 and 28 billion over 20 years to address the PFAS. So you can see that's just in Minnesota, and that's just dealing with wastewater streams. So you can see the enormous cost, and some of these settlements, uh, like I say, $1.18 billion spread across the country and a bunch of different water systems is not going to do much to clean this up. So it'll certainly help, but it's not going to be it's not going to address everything as far as the cleanup goes. Um, so let's look at some of the salient points here. Is that here and that's highlighted in bold is these bullet points here. I think are the important part of this article is removing and destroying PFAS from water and biosolids leaving Minnesota's wastewater treatment facilities could cost between 14 billion and 28 billion over 20 years. PFAS can be bought for $50 to $1,000 per pound, but cost between 2.7 million and 18 million per pound to remove and destroy from municipal wastewater. Interesting statistic there. Small wastewater treatment facilities would face per pound costs over 6 times greater than large facilities just due to economy of scale. So that's it's so it's going to hit the smallest water utilities the hardest. Well, and once again, we're dealing with wastewater here, but this is really one of the first studies that has really come up with these level of costs. So we can probably extrapolate something similar to water utilities. It may not be one for one as far as the costs go and the impacts, but certainly the same order of magnitude. So we're just going with this. But keep in mind, this we're looking at wastewater here, but it is got some actual numbers that we can see for the first time. So, and this is interesting here. New short chain types of PFAS are more difficult and up to 70% more expensive to remove and destroy compared to old long chain PFAS. Now, PFAS is a whole family of chemicals. They're perfluorinated, alkylinated compounds, and there's a whole bunch of these different compounds that are together. So some of the newer ones are shorter chain. They're not as easy to break apart as these longer chain PFAS, and so they are more difficult to clean up. So the newer stuff is more difficult than the older stuff. So that's so they go on to talk a little bit about the cost estimates are based on the required upgrades to Minnesota's existing wastewater infrastructure to treat and destroy PFAS using current commercially available technologies and PFAS levels. Now, there is a lot of research being done on PFAS remediation, so we may see some newer techniques that if it follows the normal arc of these things, we will see the costs come down as new remediation systems are developed. But right now, we're looking at some enormous costs. If you take and say, okay, 14 to 28 billion over 20 years for Minnesota wastewater systems. You extrapolate that to groundwater or to water systems in general across the country, and we're looking at some very large numbers, probably approaching, well, certainly in the hundreds of billions, if not approaching the $1 trillion mark, and these are enormous costs. So now, like I say, the normal arc of these things is as research is done and techniques are developed for cleaning these things up, costs generally come down over time. So we can expect to see that. I hope we see that, and it's going to make addressing these things a little easier. But right now, these are kind of what the costs are looking like. So kudos to the state of Minnesota for actually coming up with these numbers and publishing them. Like I say, it's wastewater, not directly applicable to the drinking water we're dealing with in this show, but it does give you an idea of the magnitude of costs we're looking at to clean these things up. So anyhow, that is there is a report available if you want to look at this, and this is published in Minnesota Pollution Control Agencies. You can go there and load the report if you want to, get into the details and the weeds on that. So, all right. So that is the latest PFAS news. Let's move on a little bit to, and this is from the Daily Mail. So pardon all the sensationalistic sidebar stuff. Daily Mail is kind of a rag out of jolly old England that deals a lot with celebrity news, but every now and then they publish some stuff. This popped up on my radar, and I just thought it would be fun to share these pictures. This is looking at the difference. The drought in California is the difference we've had from a few years ago to now, and with the rainy winter and spring and the developing El Nino situation, we're seeing reservoirs full. So this is Lake Oroville in California in 2021. This is pretty much the same view in 2023. So just current picture, so you can see how dramatically this is filled up from the height of the drought to just this last winter has pretty much filled the reservoirs. And this is kind of a neat picture here is you can just see that with the slider here, this is 2021, this is 2023. So we can slide across here and just see the dramatic difference in water levels that just that wet winter brought to California. So we can see everything's full. The boat ramps are now functioning again. Here's the same type of thing. The San Luis, which is a reservoir, which is down in the Central Valley area. Once again, this is July of 2022, and you can see it's much fuller. Not quite as dramatic as Lake Oroville, but you can see how much more full it is in March of 2023. So some dramatic pictures there of how just one wet winter can really change things as far as the reservoir goes. Now, we deal a lot with groundwater, so we know that the reservoirs are filling up, but groundwater recharge just is not going on. It's going to take a long time and many wet cycles to actually get groundwater recharge back to where it should be. So we don't expect the groundwater to bounce back quite that fast, but we do see some indications that it is bouncing back and that recharge is happening. It just takes a little longer than for the reservoirs to capture the stormwater runoff to fill things up. In groundwater, the water has to fall on the ground surface and percolate down to the water table and basically recharge that. So that's a process that takes a little while, and to build up all that groundwater storage again is going to take certainly a number of years. But this just shows that we're on the right track, and the fact that we are pretty cyclical. Let me move on to the next story here. The West gets reprieve from drought, but change predicted as El Nino approaches, and we talk a lot about climate change and some of these things, man-made, anthropogenic, which means man-made, climate change. But really the story, at least in California and a lot of the West, has to do with El Nino. And that is a pattern of weather and ocean currents that develops in the Pacific Ocean. And basically it has to do with ocean currents and weather patterns that correspond to that. It gets a little more complicated than that. I actually read an entire book on the El Nino effect, which really kind of geeked out on it a little bit. But it far more than anything else is what impacts the weather cycles and the precipitation and the drought patterns in the West. Now, usually what happens with the El Nino is what's going on in California in the West and the Pacific Coast is kind of the opposite of what's going on in Australia and Southeast Asia. Not quite one-to-one, but as the pattern shifts around from El Nino and its corresponding La Nina, this is what impacts the major weather patterns and droughts. So far more than any anthropogenic climate change, when it comes to the Pacific Coast California and a lot of the West is the El Nino cycles are really what dictates weather patterns. So let's dive into this article a little bit here. So it says much of the West Coast is experiencing a welcome break from years of historic drought due to unexpected, remarkably wet winter, even as an extraordinary snowpack begins to melt. So we have record snowpacks in California. Did shift a little north to the Cascades up in Washington and Oregon. So they got some pretty good snowpacks too. But California is experiencing some record snowpacks, which really is where California gets their water over the long term. So they pay attention to the snowpacks. So a lot of this El Nino effect. So unexpected. I don't know about that. They track the El Nino, La Nina cycles pretty heavily. Now, it's not always predictable as you would like, but to say it's unexpected, I think most of the people that were looking at the El Nino patterns saw them developing and anticipated that we would have some wet weather on the Pacific coast and in California, just probably not as much as we actually got. So from that part, I would say that was the level of precipitation we got was unexpected, but the fact that El Nino is actually developing, we knew that in advance, and we were expecting at least some drought-breaking conditions over the winter now. So that's that. Grab something to drink here. So saying is California was first to receive a series of strong storms starting in December, defying predictions that the winter would be another dry one. I think that they were looking at El Nino and knew that that was coming, but most people that weren't paying attention to that really, thought, the drought was going to continue on. And this stuff is basically cyclical. So we see that a lot of drought patterns are cyclical, and they've been sick, and if you follow the show at all, I often talk about, looking back at geologic cycles and going back in time. It really is a cyclical pattern. California is pretty much a desert. And so we've seen over time there's wetter patterns and drier patterns that predate man and any anthropogenic climate change activities. So we know it's mainly driven by patterns, cycles. There is short-term patterns, there are intermediate-term patterns, there's long-term patterns and patterns within patterns, and you can actually track these things, and it's pretty interesting. When I was in my undergrad, I did some of this looking at precipitation patterns in the Rocky Mountain area, and it's pretty amazing how these patterns really develop, and they're they happen over geologic time, but they are cyclical. So we can see that happening. So to blame it all on anthropogenic climate change is not telling the entire picture. So, and like I say, El Nino, La Nina cycles are really what drive a lot of the drought and precipitation in the western U.S. So unlike the 2021 water year in which snowfall appeared early but was scarce after early January, the strong storm train continued through mid-March. By April 1, snowpack was above normal across nearly the entire West with a few areas of snow drought. So April brought a drying and warming trend to the Southwest and above average precipitation and cooler temperatures in Oregon and Washington, reducing some of the snowpack deficits in the Cascade Range. So this is where I'm saying that it shifted north a little bit. So basically, most of the Pacific West has benefited from the El Nino cycle this winter. Temperature patterns above normal, but and so the snowpack is melting. This is normal. But because there's a lot of snowpack and there's a little bit higher temperatures, we do get some flooding. So this makes reservoir management a little more challenging. They got to keep capacity in the reservoirs to handle the snowpack melt. So that is a little bit challenging too. Um, so after 3 consecutive dry years, this wet winter brought major drought relief. Now, 1 year does not indicate the end of the drought, but I believe that it says here, yes, in the final paragraph here, El Nino conditions have already developed and are expected to gradually strengthen into winter. A stronger El Nino likely means wetter conditions in the southern U.S. and warmer conditions in the north. Scientists expect impacts from the projected transition to El Nino conditions to begin to be felt by early fall. So we're expecting another wet winter in California anyway, and maybe drought returning to Washington and Oregon. That's kind of the gist of this article. So the El Nino pattern is really what's driving this, and that is based on natural ocean currents. And so tracking El Nino, if you're interested in drought and weather patterns in the Pacific coast, very, very important. So, all right, let's move on to a next story here. As drought grips the West, let me see. I think let me fix this a little bit here. We're not picking up the whole. There we go. Well, that's about as good as I can do, I think. So let's. So as drought grips the West, feds offer cash, not necessarily water, and this kind of gets to a lot of the Colorado River Basin that we talked about a while back. They are having to cut water use in the Colorado River Basin, especially in the lower basin, and so they've come up with agreement for part of this, but not all of it. And what's happened is what the gist of this article is. The federal government has more money than water to offer as drought grips the West and force states to conserve. Now just the wet winter in California did not necessarily translate to more water, a little bit more water, but not enough water to go around in the Colorado River Basin, especially the lower Colorado River Basin. So they're having to do some pretty dramatic cuts. And right now, the feds say they don't have any water to give. More water is allocated from the Colorado River than it can actually deliver. And so we're seeing these cuts having to take place. There's no water to be had. The feds don't have any water, so they got money. They can, and basically the gist of this article is they're paying people to use less water. So. And as the quote here says, we can't always offer people water, but we can bring money. So, so hard to drink money, but hard to irrigate crops with money. But maybe you can buy some groundwater or drill some wells. That's a whole nother story. That's overtaxing the groundwater resources. So, anyway. The Colorado River is overallocated. It's got more water committed than they can actually use. So there's a struggle going on to cut back Colorado River water to the point where the river can actually meet the demands, the reduced demands that are being negotiated. It's a challenging prospect because they got to cut a lot of water use. So this is where the money does come in by paying people to fallow crops and that type of thing. Then they can use money to pay people to do that and ultimately kind of get the water use to the point where the Colorado River can actually support it. So so that's basically the gist of this is, the feds always have money. They can print it and they do print a lot of it. So coming up with cash is easier than water. So what else do they say here? Uh, the Indian tribes are definitely being affected by this, and so the cash is helping them a little bit. But obviously, people still need water. Um, so let's. So they're saying. Um, they said a 1.3 million project to install automatic gates along Carlsbad irrigation district expected to save 2,200 acre feet a year now lost through the system. So that's an acre foot. Let's just look at this. So acre foot. This is from North Marin Water District. Is the volume of water it takes to cover an acre in one foot deep. So basically, a football field, 300 feet by 160 feet, is what an acre would be. So it equates to about 325,851 gallons of water in an acre foot. You'll often hear large amounts of water being described in terms of acre feet. So that's what an acre foot is. So, all right, more drought news. Phoenix area restricts construction as groundwater evaporates. And the big news here is people are realizing that Phoenix actually is in a desert, and deserts are defined by their lack of water. As strange as it sounds, that people are coming to this realization, but hey, better late than never, right? So the lead paragraph with a surge in population growth, soaring urban development, of course, desert conditions. It comes as no surprise the Phoenix metropolitan area could one day run out of groundwater. So that's kind of what they're looking at. They're looking at coming up with some shortages here and how to deal with that. Well, the real problem is don't build so massively in a desert where the water infrastructure and the amount of water available cannot support the population you have. But obviously, that horse is out of the corral, so we can't deal with that. But so how are they going to deal with this? So one of the ways they're looking at is they're looking at alternative water sources, and developers must show state officials they have an alternative assured water supply for 100 years from non-local groundwater. So this is interesting, is how do you achieve that aim? So the study found that 4% of the metro areas, Phoenix metro area, demand for groundwater nearly 4.9 million acre feet. And remember what I showed you in that last graphic, that an acre feet is about 326,000 gallons. So you can see that's a lot of water. So 4% cannot be met over the next century. So what are you going to do about that? If the projections are correct, a massive water shortage could be nearing and have widespread implications for the post-COVID development boom. So it's kind of like building in a desert where there's no water. What do you expect? It should not come as any shock. So Thursday's announcement is a sign the water-scarce metro area situated in a desert has limitations in terms of number of homes it can support. Put that in the Captain Obvious category. So Phoenix as a metropolitan area should not exist because it does not have the water to support it. But they're gonna do this, and the way to do it is throwing money at it. And one of the big solutions is last year Arizona's Water Infrastructure Finance Authority began reviewing a proposal for a multi-billion-dollar project construct a water desalination plant in Mexico that would pump water through a 200-mile pipeline to the border state Arizona to counter its drought-driven water uncertainty. That's desalinated water is fairly expensive water, but it may be one of their only solutions. So it's going to require an international agreement with Mexico in order to do that, and building a pipeline, and then the ongoing costs of operating a desalination plant. But it may be one solution because that would be non-local groundwater. And it concludes with a rather cynical statement here, but a true one is instead of blaming climate change, Phoenix should remember they're situated in the middle of a desert, and the explosive population growth in the last several years draws down a finite resource much quicker, and that is groundwater. If the metro area wants to continue to expand, it might have to consider the 200-mile pipeline from Mexico. And this is true. Where else are you going to get water? Colorado River, tap dry. You know, they can't tap into that and provide more water from the Colorado River because they're looking at cutbacks. So we just mentioned in a previous article we talked about today, and in past shows we've done on the Colorado River. So this may be one of the few solutions they actually have is, you know, and there's been some crazy plots with piping water from the Mississippi River to the west, and just thinking about how hideously expensive that might be, and just all the permits that would be required and the construction costs. So this might be the most expedient solution, even considering the cost of how expensive that water would be. Where else are you going to go? So just an illustration of the ongoing situation where we're creating infrastructure based on the fact we think we have unlimited water, and we're building these huge cities in the middle of a water scarce desert. What do you expect? And it's going to be more expensive. Phoenix residents are going to pay more for their water for the privilege of living there. That's just the way it is if you want to live there. So that brings us to this interesting article that I came across that that I thought was interesting, and please understand this comes from the Washington Post that has a decidedly, let's say, progressive viewpoint. So they're all in on climate change and a lot of the progressive talking points. So you got to kind of filter that out a little bit. But there is some interesting points here. Is that we don't take into account, and just like we talked about Phoenix in this last article, we do not take into account that a lot of industry and investor-driven businesses really use water. I mean, who would think that, you know, we don't even stop to think about how industrial processes use water, and the fact that the water shortages are happening all over. A lot of industry in California, you know, take Apple computer, for instance, that they talk about in this article later, is that they use water in their processes. It's just part of manufacturing is you use water. But there's a risk there. If water is scarce and we have to cut back on water, what is the risk to investors that you're going to have a water shortage that's going to impact your operations? And this is something that is not currently assessed. A lot of investors do a lot of due diligence and risk assessments when they're looking at investing in things, and companies do ongoing risk assessments to look at what their exposure is to this and that, financial conditions, but nobody is really doing a risk assessment for water. And this article is pointing out that perhaps we should be doing that, because as there's more pressure on our water infrastructure, the risk of running out of water and shortages of water for industrial type operations could impact those operations, and thus the investors and the shareholders. So that's something that we really need to look at. So as always, the lead paragraph has you know, usually the most information. So if climate change is a shark, then water is his teeth. So you know, nice little soundbite there. No pun intended. That analogy, coined by climate expert James P. Bruce, is increasingly apt. Higher temperatures are straining H2O availability at the same time as demographics and economic growth increase its usage. By 2030, it's predicted there will be a 40% gap between freshwater supply and demand. Investors need to be alert to the risks posed by such shortages to the companies and industries they allocate capital to. So that 40% gap is a huge risk that they're facing, that investors really are not taking into account right now. When they do their due diligence, they're not looking at water. So, so our most vital commodity, which is water, is already facing flashing warning signs in some locations as we enter another climate-altered summer. And like I say, the Washington Post progressive viewpoint does kind of shine through in this article here, but but we're trying to stick to the point here. So, my goodness, my phone is just ringing today. But um, so and they point out just places like most of Scotland, not typically a country that's thought to be as dry, is now under an early warning for water scarcity after experiencing less than half its usual May rainfall. So England, Spain, Europe, um, Taiwan is the middle of its biggest drought in decades. So we're seeing some drought conditions, reduced groundwater recharge, and less water supply around the world. So that's going to impact industry. So now, obviously, agriculture and things like mining take into account water a lot more than some industries, manufacturing processes and stuff like that. So agriculture, water actually drives agriculture, so they know what's been going on. But a lot of these factories and things that use water in their processes do not often take this into account. But they're starting to pay more attention to it. This March saw the first United Nations Water Conference in nearly 50 years. Businesses actually showed up, not only water-intensive industries, but also financial institutions and fund managers. So they are starting to look at this and understand the risks that are growing in this. So just kind of going down here and looking at some different industries. Water is essentially in the production of pharmaceuticals, with about 23% of the world's supply used to manufacture medicines. Interesting. I didn't know that statistics. Apple Inc.'s Google consumed 14.6 billion gallons of water in 2021, mostly to cool data centers. And Meta platforms, Facebook use 678 million gallons. So it takes water to cool these big servers that run these big internet companies. So that's another water use. I believe that Google, excuse me, has a big data center up on the Columbia River, so that they are close to not only the electrical generation from the dams on the Columbia, but also a water source for cooling for their server center. So strategic placement of these industries where there's actually water that they can use, and obviously the water produced up there, or the electricity produced up there, is hydroelectric that relies on water also. So, so while technology companies can locate the water-intensive elements of their business in places where it's plentiful, others can't be so flexible because they're more tied to where their raw materials grow, and their products can be manufactured with cheaper labor. So this is kind of a driving force, and those companies may be caught a little short where they're in water-stressed areas. So big companies like Apple, Tesla, Shell still don't provide in-depth information about their water consumption, and so that's difficult for investors to do risk assessments on. So anyway, they go on. Climate issues, i.e. water issues, are affecting investor portfolios in real time, and so that's something we're seeing. So so they talk about some of the investors at the UN Water Conference signed an open letter asking governments for more action in water, but corporate investment is also vital for achieving water security. Governments can only do so much, and so companies have to assure their own future, and it's but they need to take that risk into account. So really, some pretty interesting stuff here is investors looking at the water use of the industries and companies they invest in and the risks associated thereof. So interesting stuff. All right, now on to our bacteria stories. And I deal with microbiology a lot, dealing with water wells because there are bacteria in all water wells. We tend to focus on basically just coliform bacteria, total coliform, fecal coliform, E. coli. Those are the ones you test for, but there is bacteria in drinking water, and we look at a lot of these things. Bacteria are what causes a lot of the plugging in water wells and the development of biofilms. They can cause corrosion, or they can just be there. And heavy bacterial loads can cause foul tasting water. And so it may not be a health issue, but more a water quality issue. So bacteria is just there, but I picked out a couple stories here. They just popped up on my radar that I thought was interesting because here's some research. I'm not sure how practical this is going to end up being because it's hard to change our shift towards chlorine-based disinfection, but the fact that this study identified actually a study in Sweden actually identified some predatory bacteria that eat other bacteria and could eat the coliforms. And so if you could develop a system where you take this predatory bacteria, it could actually take away or reduce our need or actually eliminate our need for using chlorine for disinfection. So how that'll work or what the practical applications are here, I don't know, but it's interesting to speculate. So they looked at what would happen if chlorine was emitted from drinking water. So they got the expected increase in bacteria, of course. But after a while, something surprising happened. A harmless predatory bacteria, so non-pathogenic bacteria, grew in numbers and ate most of the other bacteria. So we have a harmless bacteria that is consuming all the other bacteria. So possibly, since we're mainly worried about the coliform-related bacteria, is that the presence of this predatory bacteria could eliminate the need for chlorine if they could find out how to make this efficient and measure that. So they go on to point out that we have many types of bacteria, biofilm, which protects and supports bacteria in pipes and on the wells. That also causes plugging and issues. But some bacteria have adapted to life in the presence of chlorine, and we know that some of these biofilms protect the bacteria from chlorine. So it's chlorine is not always the be all and end all. So so they go on to talk about their research here, and in the journal Clean Water they published this study, and let's get down here to they talk about the background here, how we filter and clean water. So in Varberg, Sweden, chlorine was removed in 2020 following the installation of ultrafiltration, a filter that uses an extremely fine mesh sieve to prevent harmful microorganisms slipping through from lakes and groundwater. With very few bacteria entering the drinking water, chlorine was deemed to be superfluous, even though it was not known what the consequences would be for the bacterial flora. The researchers took water samples over a period of 6 months and of the non-chlorinated water. Then they went through a DNA sequence to identify or speciate all the bacteria in the water. And 1 year later, they went back and took new samples to determine what the final microbiome was like. So and they said it's as if the new restaurant had moved in. Chloramine killed certain bacteria, but we can see it was feeding other bacteria. During the period, we could see how the bacterial buffet changed. So when the chlorine disappeared, certain types of bacteria starved, while others grew and thrived. The biggest surprise for the researchers came in the third chlorine-free month, when it was observed that certain bacteria had drastically decreased in number, and one special type of bacteria had increased, namely the predatory bacteria and I'm going to butcher this name, but Bedella Brio. So that's that's a kind of a tough one there, but yeah, I think it's more B Della Brio, but that's but they kind of in this article they push it all together here. So anyway, um, we have not seen this exact type of bacteria in previous studies of this drinking water network. It's probably been lying concealed in the biofilm, was now given an opportunity. It's totally harmless for us humans. So this is a harmless bacteria that feeds on other bacteria. So just like in our garden, we have predatory insects that kill the bad insects. This is bacteria, good bacteria that kills the bad bacteria. Um, so will this work? Obviously, research is continuing. Our conclusion, thus, that it is possible to have safe and clean drinking water without chlorine. We observed no increased risk, which of course was very important to the water company and their customers. And they go on to point out there's other ways besides the ultrafiltration, which is also known as reverse osmosis. There are other ways to purify water without chlorine, such as UV light or biofilters. So this may have some application in the future. I think research is probably going to continue on that. So, all right, let's go to our last article here. The light beneath our feet. Team discovers microbes thriving, and this is phys.org is where these articles are coming from. Of course, a lot of scientific papers here, but the light beneath our feet. Team discovers microbes thriving in groundwater and producing oxygen in the dark. So let's go to the lead paragraph that usually has the summary we're looking for. Nearly a third of Earth's freshwater resources lie in groundwater, much more than all lakes, rivers, and atmosphere combined, and exceeded only by the frozen water and polar caps. Accordingly, about half of humankind depends on groundwater as a drinking water source. We don't have a whole lot of knowledge of the organisms that inhabit groundwater. We're doing more studies on that. We do, as part of our well health check, when we look at well diagnostics, we actually look at the bacteria, the total bacteria counts, anaerobic bacteria, speciating the bacteria, because certain bacteria can do certain things in a well. We know what those are. So we're actually looking at the bacteria in the well, but but a lot of is not known. I mean, if you look at these different manuals of bacteriology, they are finding new bacteria all the time, and so it's certainly an ongoing field of study. But we know that bacteria can impact groundwater in various ways. So anyway, a recent investigation led by microbial ecologist Emil Ruff of the Marine Biological Laboratory has discovered that ancient groundwaters harbor not only diverse and active microbial communities, but also unexpectedly large numbers of microbial cells. Strikingly, some of these microbes seem to produce dark oxygen, which means they're non-photosynthetic bacteria. So in the absence of sunlight, so they're producing oxygen in a dark environment. And they produce that oxygen in such abundance that oxygen may nourish not only those microbes, but also may leak into the environment and support other oxygen-reliant microbes that can't produce it themselves. And this study was published today in Nature Communications. So what the implications are is that, they talk about some of them here, but some of the unstated implications here for what we do in terms of well plugging and well diagnostics is the fact that a lot of the bacteria that produce the biofilms, iron-related bacteria, and a lot of the slime-forming bacteria actually are aerobic bacteria. They need oxygen to do what they do and perform the biofilm. So if there's certain bacteria that are producing oxygen, then that may actually extend the oxygenated zone and actually provide a more conducive environment for the development of iron-related bacteria. So Not that there's much we can do to stop that process necessarily, other than periodic well rehabilitation, but it could certainly explain how some of these aerobic zones in our well support these really healthy microbial communities that cause the plugging going on. So maybe in the future it may be something that we want to look at. Now they looked at 138 groundwater samples drawn from 14 aquifers that lie beneath 80,000 square miles of prairie in the province of Alberta, Canada, an area three times the size of Ireland. And the aim was to investigate the biogeochemistry and microbial ecology of a broad range of aquifer environments in Alberta anyway. So now situations can change around the world and in different areas, but they looked at Alberta because that's obviously there's limits to how much you can spend on research. So so they're looking at it from the point of climate change, because why not? Of course, because if you mention climate change, you can get more grant funds thrown at you. So you got to tie it back to climate change. That's my cynical and pithy comment here. Not why everything always has a climate change component, because there's more grant funds available if you tie in climate change. But beyond that, there's some interesting implications here that he goes on to say that we have indications that the microbes use the groundwater oxygen to consume methane, a greenhouse gas. Especially in the province of Alberta, methane is common in groundwaters and may leak out of the ground into the atmosphere. We now need to understand it and how much methane these microbes prevent from being emitted. Now, this has implications for certain areas of California where we have a lot of where we have methane issues in wells and other parts of the U.S. Even here in Tennessee, I've run into wells that have methane in them. So that may have some issues there. I look at it more in the case of you're producing more oxygen, and it's going to promote the growth of aerobic bacteria that can cause plugging in the well. But we got a couple different implications here. So surprisingly, the team found significantly more microbial cells in older groundwater samples than in younger groundwaters, suggesting these ancient groundwaters have evolved over time to provide energy for microbes to grow. This discovery runs counter to prior studies in subsurface ocean and land ecosystems that found microbial cell density commonly decreases as depth decreases, presumably due to energy limitations. So a little bit of surprising findings there that we're looking at ancient groundwaters versus current groundwaters, and it may be how some of those microbial communities even survive, especially the aerobic ones. So they go on to talk a little bit about oxygen, and so this is just kind of a fluff stuff here. But he does say that using oxygen for respiration releases a lot of energy that an organism can use to grow and propagate. So they're saying that by these organisms providing oxygen, it can induce the growth of these aerobic bacteria, and that's where I get to my point. This could have implications for well plugging by anaerobic bacteria, oxygen-loving bacteria. All right, so those are our groundwater stories today. I hope you found them interesting. This is stuff that I go through. I pick up that I think may be interesting to folks out there and have implications for the groundwater industry. And so some of them aren't directly related, but they can have implications for us in the water business. So I thought that the sharing this news from time to time can really help us plan things out, or at least understand our water systems a little bit better. So that is the show for today. We are always looking for guests to be on Groundwater Talk Live. If you have a groundwater topic you'd like to talk about, and we cover a range of them here, this is the URL to book book time to come on with me on Groundwater Talk Live. If you don't want to come on live, we can record the show. I like to do them live just because it's we do get some comments and stuff from people, but if you want to come on the show, then I'd love to have you. So also we stream. Let me put that up here. We stream on the Groundwater Guy channel on YouTube, and all our past we got over 90 videos now on the Groundwater Guy YouTube channel. So large variety of topics. Check them out there, and we also stream on LinkedIn. We stream on Twitter, Twitch, and Facebook as well. And so we stream a variety of places, but YouTube and LinkedIn are the main places I go and hang out on, and so we're trying to reach people. So I stream to those other platforms, but those are the main two. So, all right. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the Groundwater Guy YouTube channel. Hit the bell if you want to know when we are going to go live for our next show. We try to go every Thursday, 11 a.m. Central Time, unless some of these technological glitches prevent us. But we'll be here, and we will be back next week. So thank you very much for watching, and